Thank you all for being here. I'm Mario Small. This is Scott Allard. We're both here to just give you a couple brief words to get us started. First, we want to thank some important people who made this possible. We want to thank the Office of the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives. We want to thank the Division of Social Sciences here at the University of Chicago. We want to thank NORC. We want to thank the Departments of Sociology, the Population Research Center at NORC, and the School of Social Service Administration for supporting us in multiple kinds of ways to make this possible. We certainly want to thank one person who I think you've all met in some capacity at this point, Caroline Auerkirk, who has made all of this possible. Pretty much anything that we have no idea how it works, you can pretty much just ask Caroline. The breakfast looks great. And of course, her wonderful staff, whom I just met this morning, thank them as well. We also, of course, want to thank our speakers and discussants for writing some extremely interesting papers for us and preparing some, I'm sure will be very interesting remarks for the talk. A couple words about how we got started on this and when we'll get right onto it. Before I get started, this endeavor, this conference, is part of an initiative taking place at the University of Chicago that at the moment we're calling the University of Chicago Urban Network. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is a work in progress. A work in progress that's so much a work in progress that even though it's already online, you can't find it on Google yet. So you are part of the very privileged few who have the opportunity to see something before it's actually ready for prime time. But if you go on your computers at some point to urban.uchicago.edu, what you'll find is the other effort of the initiative that brought you this conference. And it is an effort to bring together the latest research across the social sciences and the most important resources across the social sciences on urban questions that would be of interest not just to researchers, but also to practitioners and policymakers and students and journalists and the general educated public. I won't go through it at the moment because we want to make sure we keep on time. But I strongly encourage you to have a look. You'll see that the Urban Portal is currently in beta and that we welcome your feedback. If you click on that, we really want to hear from you. We want this to be an extremely valuable resource. This conference is the product of both intellectual interests and policy-related, or scholarly interests and policy-related interests. On the scholarly side, one of the things that's remarkable is that over the past 20 to 25 years, in the study of urban poverty, across the social sciences, in political science, in sociology, in economics, public health, what has emerged is really a kind of interdisciplinary community working on more or less the same problems, more or less the same issues, and citing across disciplines in ways that really wasn't the case, at least hasn't been the case historically, even though has been the case at small moments in time. Certainly for the past 20 years, if you look at the literature, for example, on the consequences of the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, the consequences of living in poor neighborhoods, recently the consequences of incarceration, the dynamics of incarceration, the consequences of the deindustrialization of the cities in the Midwest and the Northeast. This work today has been produced by scholars in more and more diverse disciplines, speaking to scholars across multiple disciplines to a greater extent than actually is typically the case in our extremely factionalized and independent intellectual communities. I think one of the consequences of this has been an extremely rich body of work, but at the same time a body of work that for the last 20 years could be characterized as focusing on a surprisingly narrow set of questions given how broad the kinds of scholars working on them are. I think it's only a slight exaggeration to say that in the mainstream scholarly work on urban poverty, the principal units of analysis, not necessarily the principal units of observation, but certainly of analysis, have been the individual and the neighborhood. So we for sure have studied, for example, in the context of housing, probably in that field, the most important body of work has to do with the moving to opportunity experiments, which are essentially a set of experiments about the consequences of individuals moving from poor neighborhoods to non-poor neighborhoods. And of course, the many bodies of work that are associated with that. Similarly, there's a lot of work by some of the people in this audience on the consequences of social disorganization at the neighborhood level for crime among the individuals and for others, for social capital among individuals and for other sorts of outcomes at the individual level. Cognitive development. In the context of education, there's been a lot of focus on skills, on the black-white skills gap, for example. As you know, there's been a lot of work on this question, again, focusing on the individual. In the context of immigration, when we've talked about immigration in the context of urban poverty, we've looked at what consequences immigration have had for the labor prospects of African Americans, particularly poor African Americans, the labor prospects and the employment prospects of people who are living locally. For sure, we believe this work is important. Part of what is animating this conference is that there's an entire body of work in which the organization, rather than the individual or the neighborhood as the unit of analysis, that could inform these questions in interesting ways. In which the institution, rather than just the individual or the neighborhood, as a unit of analysis, can inform these questions in important ways. So for example, when we're thinking about immigration and the economic consequences of immigration, rather than focusing solely on the employment prospects of local poor individuals, what happens and what do we learn, for example, when studying an increasingly prominent phenomenon, the presence of transnational organizations that are channeling the transfers of economic remittances from the United States to countries elsewhere. This is an organizational level problem. The transnational organization is an organization. These organizations are mediating the transfer of funds. What happens, for example, when we think about crime and the consequences of imprisonment, not just in terms of the probability that the individual who's been imprisoned will get a job, but thinking about the criminal justice system as an institution, as an entity with multiple organizations, multiple sectors, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the state involved, with multiple kinds of interests that either fail to or coalesce in ways that are either positive or negative for the future prospects of people who've been incarcerated. In other words, in the context of housing, criminal justice, of education for sure, of health, what happens when we turn attention to the organizational and institutional dynamics that we know are part of what's happening, but we haven't studied in this interdisciplinary body of work because we've sort of followed, we've been path dependent in terms of our own work, focusing on the individual and the neighborhood. What we're hoping to do today is begin to try to answer that question. What happens when you answer and when you ask different kinds of questions? We have a phenomenal set of speakers. Scott Allard is now going to talk to you about some of the policy implications of what we're hoping to talk about, and then he'll turn it over to the first set of panelists.
I just also want to thank Mario for his intellectual leadership of both this conference, but also the Urban Network. And one of the really great things about coming to the University of Chicago a couple years ago for me was a chance to hang out and do work with Mario. And so this is a treat for me, and I deeply appreciate being able to be involved in this. I won't take too much time because I know we're just, we're already, like in a good academic conference, 15 minutes behind already. So a couple administrative points. One, the restrooms, if you're not familiar with this building, are downstairs. They're out the doors of the cinema and downstairs. So take note of that. There'll be refreshments and things outside in the main area there throughout the day. Lunch will be back where we had breakfast. We ask that you don't come and go while people are speaking, especially if you're kind of going through rows. And this will become more of an issue as we have more people come throughout the day. So if you have any questions, Mario, I, and Caroline will be able to answer them. Mario gave us a great kind of the scholarly setting or the intellectual setting for this, but this matters in terms of policy as well. Increasingly in our communities, we're targeting resources at particular neighborhoods or areas in need, or at particular populations living in particular spaces. And one of the motivations for this conference was to think about the implications of that and think about the unanswered questions. Not only what interventions work, but what are some of the practical implementation issues or issues in the community as we think about that. And in Chicago, this is a really profound issue, as increasingly governmental and non-governmental organizations are trying to do not only more with less, but do more in fewer places and not have such a mission spread across such a wide geography. So hopefully part of this conference will be speaking to those issues as well. With that, I'd love to invite the panelists to come up to the front, and it's my pleasure to introduce the discussant for this panel, Mary Patillo, who is the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and American Studies at Northwestern University. So thank you.